50% of all veterans leave their first job within the first year after separation from the military. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably something a lot of people in the industry are contemplate as they're looking for veterans to bring them onto their workforce. So, what I understand is, when we look at that transition from military experience, for a lot of individuals, that's their first, real time job as an adult, and we get many things with that profession or with that job. Um, a sense of meaning and purpose, obviously employment and, the ability to support ourselves. But for a lot of individuals, when they transition beyond military service, there's not a lot of focus on finding, what you're most passionate about or finding the career field that you think that you're most suitable for. And unfortunately, a lot of individuals, because they either they're not taught to, or they just don't think better, they don't have a lot of metrics to use to figure out what they want their career to be. So, it can be a very stressful time as anybody who's ending, who has a job that's coming to an end. Like, of course, one of the biggest things on your mind is, okay, how am I going to continue to support myself and or my family? So I think that leads a lot of individuals to simply looking for, where can I get a job? There might be a lot of question or self-doubt as to whether you could, perform or excel or succeed in the civilian world. I know that's something that I really contemplated or dealt with as I was transitioning out. After 17 years in the Marine Corps and successes I'd had along the way, I was really questioning if any of that was transferable, and if there were, seeds of my success or experience in the military that could transfer to, successes afterwards.
Right.
But even after 17 years or so, I was really questioning, where might I be of value outside of this uniform or without this uniform? And I think that's something that weighs on a lot of individuals' minds. So I think there can be some influence of really a fear-based decision of, oh, I just need to find a job. Like, you know, having something that's really
Oh,
satiating and fulfilling of my passion, like that's great. But I also got bills to pay, or I'm going to have bills to pay in the, in the future. So I think that leads a lot of individuals to the number one metric, which is, can I get a job? And if so, how much can I earn? And very quickly, as individuals go through that transition and begin to realize how much that experience in the civilian world is different from everything they left behind in the military, there can be a lot of, kind of new awareness of, wow, this, this lack of meaning or purpose, or this role that I have, it doesn't really fulfill those needs that I had for, a sense of value, a sense of meaning, sense of purpose. So that and many other reasons, I think, is a big reason that so many individuals will leave their first civilian job, when they transition out of the military. And I'm sure there's a lot of other things that we'll dig into today that also play a role in some of those mental or psychological challenges that veterans face.
I have been thinking about this a lot, partially in preparation for our conversation today, but just generally speaking, I mean, we hear a lot about the struggles that veterans have reintegrating into society.
Mm,
And I have thought about it in a few ways because I know a ton of people who have been laid off after long careers 5 years, 10 years, 15, 25, 32 years. I met a lady the other day, and they kind of had the same sort of, oh shit, now what? Like, how
mm,
am I going to start over? And when I'm trying to synthesize how those could be different, but also how they're the same,
right.
I'm thinking about, okay, leadership and teamwork purpose, because most jobs
Mm,
do not have any of that. Most jobs are, box checking, rote activities. You're doing the same thing over and over. You're not really expected to outperform, outshine. You're definitely not expected to teach, mentor, tutor, bring up the next generation, anything like that. But the structure of the military, from what I've experienced through my dad, both of my parents, both of my fathers and my
mm,
stepmother being in the military, it's very structured in the hierarchy. So even when you're like the very first promotion from like an E1 to E2, now you have like
mm,
real responsibility. And then it just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. So you have these men and women who have spent 4 years at minimum, I guess, in like an actual purpose driven leadership position. And I think that equates to someone who has been like running a department for 30 years, right? Like the lady I
mm,
was referencing earlier.
yeah.
Um, so the I guess the bonus of being in the military, of teaching you how to be a leader, is also maybe the drawback, because when you leave, you have nothing or maybe I can't say you have nothing, but there's that prospect, or it
Right.
seems that the stats are showing that generally people have a difficult time getting back into that position. Is that is it?
Yeah, I
I don't
think
know.
that
Am I
plays a
off
lot
base there?
into it. No, I think so. I think you're onto something. I think that plays a lot into it. And one of the things, and I appreciate you bringing this up because as I look at and work with, veterans going through that transition, that military transition, I also look at what insights I can gain from just the human experience that they're going through. And then with those
Mhm.
insights, how can they be helpful to other individuals? So, what I
Mm.
understand is that a major part of the challenge of military transition is the loss of the way that individuals have met some of their fundamental human needs. So as humans,
Okay.
as biological creatures, we share the same, needs for survival that other mammals do, food, water, and shelter. But as humans, we have some unique needs. One is for connection
Mhm.
and also for a sense of meaning and purpose. So connection, we're biologically hardwired as humans for connection. We're tribal creatures. We're designed to do our best when we're part of a group. There's many things that are hardwired into our body that allow pro-social experiences or pro-social activities to actually help us with our mental wellness, our longevity, our emotional and mental well-being. And then we also gain something very important through a strong sense of meaning. And what I've come to understand is that meaning is not just something that, adds little context and flavor to life, but meaning is really what provides our capacity to endure struggling. So when we
Mm.
have a very strong sense of meaning, when the work that we're doing or the contribution that we make provides a strong sense of meaning, with that also comes our capacity to endure a lot of the challenges that we might face along the way. So when a service member transitions out of the military, whether that's after 4 years or whether it's after 30 years, really their entire adult life, the way that they've come to meet these fundamental human needs for connection and with connection, also a need for authenticity. And then thirdly, that need for meaning, the way that they've come to meet these needs is really stripped away from them. And I think this is what compounds that challenge as individuals try to decide what they're going to do later. We really take it for granted. When you've had a basic need met for a number of years, you kind of take for granted the fact that anything else you do might also meet those needs. But what a lot of veterans confront is as they transition out of the military, they realize that this very strong need that we have for belonging, connection to a tribe, meaningful work, it's not a guarantee. And it's actually, for a lot of individuals, unfortunately, it's not likely that you'll be able to replace that, at least to the degree that you once experienced it, once you've taken off that uniform. So this leads to a lot of those challenges of, as you talked about, stepping from one level of responsibility down to another. Everything that we do in the military is honestly, it's looked at through a level of intensity that you don't find on the outside, short of maybe, first responders and firefighters. But
Right.
everything that we do is always looked at through the lens of life or death. Every decision that we make, every training evolution that we go through, everything that we do is preparing us for decisions that are going to have life and death consequences, either things that will help make us more lethal on the battlefield or things that will help protect American lives. If a nation's enemies were to come after us. So when you're used to seeing and operating through that level of intensity, then that step down to a civilian role where maybe you're working on a budget or putting some presentations together to try to get a little bit more market share in your company, they don't translate the same level of intensity. And for a lot of individuals that are used to operating that way, that can leave a tremendous void. And then that point about responsibility, when I think back to how much responsibility was bestowed on me, even as a, young 30 something, pilot in the Marine Corps, when I think to, other peers and counterparts, I mean, even looking back on them, like now I'm older than than the colonels that I used to work for, who I used to think had, all the experience and all the wisdom in the world. And I'm realizing
Yep.
like, wow, that 42-year-old was in charge of billions of dollars of equipment and thousands of service members. When we look at the equivalent to a civilian corporation, like that's a pretty sizable, medium sized major company, and the age with which people have that kind of level of responsibility in that intense framework of everything being life or death. When you step away from that, even if you step into a major leadership position at a company or at a corporation, there's still going to be something that lacks. I mean, I was working with one veteran not long ago, and he said, he used to be a senior enlisted sailor. And he said, I'm, in my 30s, I was used to being responsible for, the bridge of a ship and all the onboard operations and, hundreds of sailors that all reported to him. And now I'm making spreadsheets and trying to, improve the reporting system at this company. He says, I feel like I'm so underutilized that it really affected the way that he felt about himself and his overall mental and emotional well-being as a result.
What role does like assignment of jobs, assignment of housing units, assignment of all of these essential needs that you're discussing, what does that play when you go out into civilian life where it's no longer assigned? You have to figure
Mhm.
it out and find it. And I guess maybe the question I'm really asking is, does the military do anything to help service members figure out how to find that meaning instead of just giving it to them?
Yeah, so great question. I mean, I think all of us derive a sense of meaning from different things. And during the transition, that's not something that I recall ever being mentioned. I mean, maybe there was some, puffery about the idea of, oh, go do something that's important to you. But one of the challenges that I found, as I transitioned out is when you're in the military, once you've joined the military, there's not a whole lot of latitude on what you can do. Once you have your MOS assignment, you pretty much know what you're going to be doing to a degree for the rest of the time that you're in the military. And with that, you always know, like, all right, what are the next steps that I need to do in order to get the next promotion or to prepare for the next duty station or to prepare for the next deployment. And one thing that I found extremely overwhelming when I got out of the military was realizing that now really anything was a possibility for me. Anything that I was interested in or passionate about, there was no detailer or no monitor that was telling me what I had to do next or what my next job might be. And I think naturally a lot of, individuals have many different passions across a broad spectrum of topics or ideas or
Right.
industries. So I really found it overwhelming to have to decide, okay, what do I want to invest my time and energy and maybe the rest of my life into when I have so many different things that I could envision my future in many different fields or doing many different things and see myself being satisfied in that. So it was really quite overwhelming. And maybe that's another factor that plays into the challenge that veterans experience when they transition out and leads to those high turnover rates, especially in those first jobs, is you're trying to survive, so you just want to get a paycheck and you go find a place that you can map your experience in the military to a reasonable salary outside. And then maybe once
Yep.
the dust begins to settle and you realize that honeymoon phase of that transition is over, you start to second guess or maybe think more about, okay, what do I really want to be doing? And that's a big challenge. A lot of veterans, most veterans, everyone I've talked to, when they transition out, they all go through some variation of what I've come to understand as the trauma of military transition. For
Hmm.
some individuals, it's right away. They grab that DD-214 or that discharge paperwork, and the reality of it hits them, and they really enter, a dark and a very overwhelming time. And for other individuals, it settles in a little bit more slowly, either after, 30 days when your body realizes that you're not just on an extended leave, or after 3 years when you're not getting that call, okay, it's time for that next thing. The operational tempo
Uh,
and everything that you experience in the military, you're used to having new challenges placed before you and new duty stations or new opportunities presented to you every couple of years. So when you settle into this new rhythm and realize, like, oh no, I might be doing this exact same thing in this exact same seat for the next 10 or 15 years, that can be a little jarring for a lot of individuals. So I think there's a lot of things that factor into that, that high turnover rate. But I think you certainly touched on something with individuals trying to figure out what that sense of meaning is, and maybe seeing opportunities where they can pursue something that could provide a greater sense of meaning or alignment with their values and opportunities that are interesting.
okay. I do think, or I am wondering then, how we can coach maybe a service member who's listening now
Mm.
into making that transition smoother. Like, is there something other than plug away and you'll figure it out that we can offer?
I think so. And, and the evidence out there is that we need to find something better because as a population, veterans are more than twice as likely to struggle with mental health challenges or suffer with addiction.
Hmm.
Veterans are at least 57% more likely to commit suicide. We keep hearing about this number 22 a day.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, recent reports suggest that number could be as high as 40 or 44 a day, especially
Oof.
when you account for accidental overdoses or poisonings or death due to high risk behaviors where maybe an individual wasn't going out to intentionally take their life, but they were engaging in things
Oh.
in order for the adrenaline rush or in order to kind of escape their mind that ultimately led to an unintentional death. So these, when we see these statistics, it's overwhelmingly apparent to me that the system as it is and the model that we're following is not working. And that's really what inspired me to deliver. I did a TEDx talk in 2024. Wow, it seems doesn't seem that long ago now. But really, that was my mission, was to share a message. I at least wanted to plant some seeds into a veteran's mind or in a service member's mind as to what they might experience. Because when I was, you do go through some transition prep classes. They call it the TAP classes or TRS classes. You do go through that when you transition from the military. But the majority of that, as I recall, was focused on, how do you write a resume? How do you interview
Mm.
for a job? How do you get on apartmentfinder.com and find some place to live? How do you fill out a basic budget if you're not really sure what your salary or what your income might look like? But nothing was talking about some of the mental and emotional challenges that every veteran experiences. So the TEDx talk that I delivered, it's called The Unspoken Trauma That All Veterans Face. And really what the idea I wanted to present was that transition from military service itself is often traumatic. When you lose that connection, when you lose that authenticity and the positive identity from wearing that uniform, and when you lose that profound sense of meaning, that creates some very real consequences to your overall well-being. One of the hardest things that we can face, or some of the greatest suffering that we can experience, is when we're suffering and we don't know why or where it came from. And as I
Mm.
often share, if you and I were to, strap on some tennis shoes and go for like a 12-mile run, I don't know if you run regularly, but if we went for a 12 or 15-mile run today and we woke up tomorrow and we were in excruciating discomfort, it would make sense to us why our muscles were sore and why our bones were aching, because we'd know
Okay.
where it came from. And if you know where it comes from and you understand why you're going through a momentary struggle, then you also have hope and an understanding that it's not always going to be that way, that things will change and things will get better. But if you woke up one morning and you were experiencing that excruciating pain or that discomfort and you had no idea where it came from, then it can be very hard to envision that things might change or things might get better. And that's a trap that a lot of veterans fall into. They'll go through some of these mental and emotional challenges. They'll experience some mental health problems. Maybe they'll begin to rely more on unhealthy coping mechanisms to avoid, escape, or numb the challenges. And when you're in that darkness, if you don't know how you got there, it's very challenging to find your way out. So that was the main message of my TEDx talk, was that I just want individuals to understand we have these fundamental human needs for our emotional and mental well-being. As you transition out of the military, you lose the way that you've come to meet those needs. It doesn't mean you can't regain it, but it does mean that you're going to go through a really serious and challenging transition as you begin to find and fill those needs in new ways.
What's the typical age range when a service member exits the service? I'm imagining that first round of 4 years is probably pretty typical. Not as many people continue on. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I probably the most individuals they join and serve for 4 to 6 years, depending on their enlistment, and
Mm-hmm.
then so the typical age somebody transitions, 22 at the earliest, and then if somebody joins when they're 22 after earning a college degree and they serve for a full 30 years, and it could be 52 years old, but the majority of individuals, it's going to be in their late 30s. One of the things that I really come to understand is as veterans transition out, one of the ways I describe it is that we're really going through a second adolescence. You think about the initial, our adolescence and maybe
Oh, I
that
like
first
that.
transition for everybody when they become 18 and they go out to the world for the first time. Really, that's similar to the experience of veterans that transition out of the military. They have to reestablish their foundation of values, beliefs, assessments, understanding of the world and their place in it. And if you don't realize it or look at it through that lens, we understand that 18, 20 and to 20-year-olds are going to face some challenges as they transition out, and they probably expect it themselves. They understand that they're stepping into a new world, but it's not as apparent to the service member as they transition out. So I think that is another contributing factor that deals to a lot of the challenges, because for me personally, when I retired from the Marine Corps, I was living in the same community, shopping at the same grocery store, going to the same restaurants. I didn't think anything was really going to change, but so much had changed inside of me and so much had changed from my personal experience that now everything around me felt a little different.
I was thinking about that too. Are these service members, because the picture that is painted in my mind right now is not substantially different than a prisoner being released from prison. It's a
Mhm.
man on the sidewalk holding a duffel bag, waiting for a taxi. Is is it typical for a veteran to, or a service member when they become a veteran, to kind of be let loose in the city where they were last stationed? Are they going back home to their old support network? I guess we're dealing with like a thousand different ways that this could be, especially if the service member has a family, right?
Right.
If we're just dropping people loosey goosey in a place where they, I don't want to say don't belong, but like it's not home.
Right.
How much worse is it in that scenario? Like, how do we transition that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and again, so about 200 to 250,000 service members transition out every year. And for everyone, the
That's
experience is going to be unique. So for those, one-time enlistment service members that they serve for 4 years or 6 years and they get out, depending on their living situation, they might be going back home to where they came from. Some individuals, they found a new place that they want to call home. So it really depends. For at least when I transitioned, this has been 10 years ago now, every individual was at least paid to cover their travel and their move back to their port of entry or where they came from,
oh,
their home of record. So
interesting.
there are some benefits to help individuals transition back. They're not just like, okay, you're cut off now. Give us your uniform and grab your stuff. It's not quite as abrupt. But for a lot of individuals, especially if they've been in the military for more than 6 or 8 years, they're typically living out in town, living amongst the local economy. Many have families that they're living with and supporting. So their living condition might not change much. For me, I
Hmm.
stayed in the same house that I was living in, and live now in the same community that I last served. So my situation's a lot different than somebody who maybe their last duty station they were overseas and now they have to move back from Japan or from Germany and reintegrate with their community.
Interesting. Are there statistics on the differential in experience for someone who exits like with a family and community ties, or exits and returns to a family and community ties? Basically, we're talking about the family being
hmm
available at the moment of exit. Is there a statistical difference in sort of experience, job loss, all of the mental health issues that we've talked about for folks who actually did land in a support network?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I haven't seen anything that delved as deeply into the details as that. I would suspect that would be some differences. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in the research about veterans or service members in general is, I guess, speaks to a little bit of the motivation as to why many people join. So, are you familiar
Mm.
with the ACE score or adverse childhood experience? Have you ever heard of that term before? So basically, there's this study that really quantifies adverse childhood experiences. So anything that might happen between birth and 18 years old that somebody experiences while they're growing up, and it looks at adverse conditions or situations that a person might have faced that could potentially lead to some mental health or emotional consequences in their future. So this study, the results of the study demonstrate that individuals with, so there's 10 different experiences that they look at, and if you experience one of those things, then that would be an indicator of 1 point on the ACE scale. What they found is that individuals with an ACE score of 4 or more are more than twice as likely to experience mental health challenges, struggle with addiction, struggle with maladaptive coping mechanisms later in their life. Once you cross that threshold of 4 or more, there's a lot more potential consequences for somebody throughout the rest of their life. So one of this
Mhm.
interesting study that I found was that service members are 2.5 times more likely to have an ACE score of 4 or more when they join the military. So one of the things this tells me is that some individuals, they might be joining the military as a way to get out of a situation or an environment that they've come from. Maybe they grew up through an experience that wasn't helping meet some of their basic human needs, wasn't helping provide that safe, supportive environment, sense of community and belonging that allow individuals to thrive. And with that in mind, I would suspect that many of those individuals would either try to avoid going back to that situation. Now that they've come out, they've had some adult experience, they've had some successes and grown in ways that they can now leverage to chart a different path in life. For those individuals, I would suspect that they're not as likely to go back to where they came from, or if they do, it's going to be in a kind of a completely different way. But for those who do that go back to that same environment, then I think there probably is a greater likelihood that they're going to struggle with some of those interpersonal challenges as they settle into that transition.
That's that's compounding on the negative there, I think. You're taking folks who were already potentially destined for mental health issues, and they're using the military as the escape, and perhaps it works. So I'm thinking of like some kids that I knew when I was younger, and they had mental health, and they would take medicine for it, and then
Mhm.
they'd have that period of 2 or 3 weeks where they didn't have any episodes or whatever, and they're like, so I don't need my medicine, and then that's when all the shit breaks loose. So when
Mhm.
the medicine of military service, they decide that they don't need it anymore and they exit. I know that's probably a terrible analogy, but I think in
No,
visuals
I think there's
and
something in there. I think there's something there too. And for some individuals, it might really be in a, hey, this is my chance to escape an environment. Maybe it was criminally justice inspired. I don't know that that happens as much anymore. But when
maybe.
I joined the military, there were some people that were trying to defer adjudication or get preferred sentencing by joining the military. But there's
Hmm.
certainly individuals. I went to basic training with some individuals that were coming out of gang situations and broken homes and very kind of dire situations. And those individuals, what one might think is that those individuals um, maybe because of their motivation or their prior experience, maybe they're not best suited for military service. But honestly,
I
what
was
I
gonna ask.
found is sometimes because of that external motivation and the motivation of their circumstances, they really leaned into and embraced the opportunity with a lot more gratitude than other individuals might have. Some people, hey, I'm getting 3 meals a day. I haven't had that for years. They were really excited and appreciated the experience, and then used that opportunity as one to really promote and accelerate their personal growth into the individual they can become. So one of the challenges that we have when individuals grow up in an environment that's not conducive to their mental and emotional well-being and their development is that the greatest cost I believe is the cost that it has to the way that we feel about ourselves, to our self-esteem, to our understanding of who we are and what we're capable of. So when you can be removed from that environment and placed in an opportunity or placed in a role where you can begin to understand and appreciate the value that you have, the capacity or the capabilities that you have as an individual, then this can be that opportunity to, to really promote that individual's growth and their path or their journey to wellness. But then to your point, if the military service is the way that they found and the only way that they've experienced a real strong sense of belonging, the positive self-identity, that tribe aspect of being part of a unit, and that sense of meaning that provides a capacity to endure suffering, then when that's lost or when that's taken away from them, if they haven't done a lot of that personal growth, if they haven't overcome some of those barriers or challenges from their past, then it can be the same as taking away that medication, taking away. I don't like to use the term coping mechanism because in this regard, I think it's a lot more positive than the term coping, the connotation of the current term coping. But in some ways, that's what they're experiencing. So yes, that could potentially lead to some of the statistics or some of the challenges after military service.
All right, so we gotta, I guess, now start to talk about what tools veterans can actually use to start working on it. Obviously, there's 1,000 different situations a veteran could end up in when they exit the service, but everybody can start to work towards the connections, the meaning, those kinds of things, right?
Mhm. I reckon they can. Hopefully, there's a path to it.
Okay,
Yeah.
and
So,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Go.
As veterans are transitioning out, and this is really the work that I do, is helping individuals. Typically I'll connect with individuals either after they've had some justice involvement, or when they realize that their maladaptive coping mechanism, the substances, the behaviors that they're relying on, uh, aren't the best path for them, or are creating some negative consequences. Just kind of an aside, I love the definition of addiction that's shared by Dr. Gabor Mate. Sometimes when we think of the word addiction, we think of some, this kind of almost arbitrary short list of substances or behaviors that we typically think of as behaviors or substances of abuse. But Dr. Gabor Mate kind of shines a little bit more light on it with a broader definition of addiction. He says that addiction can manifest in any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary relief or pleasure in, suffers a negative consequence as a result of, and yet has difficulty giving it up.
Hmm.
That's a little bit of a long definition, but there's so much nuance in there that I really think shines some light on addictions and or any behavior that a person is using that's creating a negative consequence in their life. Now, it could be the obvious, marijuana, alcohol, methamphetamines,
Right.
opioids, but it can also be any other behavior that a person constantly runs to in order to avoid, escape, or numb something that's going on the inside that they don't like to contend with, or that's uncomfortable to contend with. I really believe that somebody who Netflix binges every night, or is drawn into social media, or is doing,
Mm-hmm.
engaged in anything that's creating a negative consequence in their life. Maybe that negative consequence is it's robbing their opportunities for career advancement, or it's negatively affecting their relationships at home or with significant others. If it's a consequence that you're experiencing because of the way that you are trying to deal with some internal void or some internal suffering, then there's an opportunity there to experience a better version of your life and become less reliant on these external mechanisms. And I really believe this journey starts with, looking back at that CAM framework, or the connection, authenticity, meaning framework. It really starts with learning how to reconnect. So as I mentioned, our bodies as humans, we're biologically hardwired for connection. There's pro-social things that we can do, whether it's laughing together as a group, experiencing something new with other individuals, acts of service, um, simple movements that we can do, like smiling and inspiring a smile in somebody else, or embracing in a hug and holding it for longer than 20 seconds. These are all things that release a flood of oxytocin in our body, which is often referred to as the love hormone or the bonding hormone. But one of
Right.
the things that oxytocin does is it reduces the cortisol and the adrenaline in our body. It helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system. It helps us calm down a little bit. And studies have shown that those individuals that have more healthy and more nurturing connections in their life have better immune function, better overall health, better overall mental and emotional well-being. In fact, the opposite is what's been reported on recently in the national, in the Surgeon General's national report came out a few years ago. They found that individuals without proper social connection, those who lacked proper social connection and sense of belonging, had similar or the same adverse effects to their health and overall longevity as smoking 15 cigarettes a day or drinking 6 or more alcoholic beverages. It'd be no
Wow,
shock to
that's a
anybody that,
lot.
that those behaviors would have negative implications for your overall well-being and certainly your longevity in life. But they found that those individuals who don't have proper social connections experience similar adverse effects.
So is there like I guess a standard social group that you would steer service members towards? You have local VA hospitals all over. I'm
Mhm.
sure they have various support groups, but those might feel more like rehab or something like that.
Gotcha.
You probably want something more fun, right?
Yeah, certainly. So as we try to reestablish those social groups and those connections and make those bonds, but what I've found is that there's there's great opportunity to do some work before that. So one of the challenges that comes with that loss of connection is because it's such a fundamental need to our survival, because our bodies are hardwired for this connection. When we lose it, it can elicit or it can drive us into a constant fight or flight state, the
Right.
survival state, this heightened sense of alertness. And the way that we might come to meet that need for connection is a way that also jeopardizes our sense of self and our positive identity and our self-worth. So for example, if you lose your sense of connection, we also have this need for authenticity, which is, if connection is a permission to be part of a group, authenticity is your ability to be part of that group, yet show up as you are, expressing your authentic wants, needs, desires, asking for your needs to be met
Okay.
without
So
fear
not
that it'll
having
cost you
to,
your connection. So
without
if you
having
are
to do your, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so if you show up and you have this opportunity where you can either meet your need for connection or you can satiate your need for authenticity, connection is a need that's more fundamental to our nature of survival. So what we'll typically do is we'll sacrifice that need for authenticity in order to establish the connection. So what this looks like is, instead of showing up as we are, we'll show up as a version of ourselves that we think other people will accept. So this
Hmm.
means we might wear a mask. We'll show up as a projection of ourselves, or we'll show up according to the way that we think other people expect us to. The challenge is I put on this mask to connect with other individuals. They're not seeing me, they're seeing the mask that I wear, and that's what they're connecting with. And sadly, the message that I'm seeing on the inside of this mask that I'm wearing is that in somehow or in some way, I'm not good enough just as I am. When you live in this kind of environment or this situation for long enough, it really begins to erode your sense of self-worth, your sense of self-esteem, your estimate of who you are, the value that you bring. And over time, if we continue to pursue relationships in this inauthentic way, it will continue to erode the mental and emotional well-being that we have. So with this in mind, what I believe is the first step to reestablishing, nurturing, and positive connections is learning to reconnect with ourselves. This can be on a biological level by reconnecting, by learning some regulation practices, learning to bring peace and coherence to our central nervous system, and connecting with the value and the worth that we have as an individual. If your expression of yourself, if your estimate of yourself has begun to erode, then one of the things that we need to do to create the possibility for authentic connection is to reconnect with the version of us that we love and respect and that we know is worthy and deserving of connections with others. So with the work that I do, I typically start, one of the first exercises or opportunities that I'll share with individuals is, let's sit down and make a list of wins and successes that you've had in your life. Let's do an assessment of the innate strengths that you have. Because from this, one of the consequences of being in this fight or flight state is that we're highly attuned to potential threats that might exist in our environment.
Right.
One of the things that we become attuned to is potential threats that exist within us. So instead of being mindful and aware of the innate strengths and the past experiences that we've had that demonstrate or that prove our value and our worth, we become more mindful or more attuned to mistakes that we've made in the past, potential weaknesses that we have that might become a certain threat. And as in this fight or flight state, as our
Hmm.
perception, as our aperture begins to narrow down on just the things that we don't like about ourselves, this further erodes that sense of confidence or self-worth or value that we have, and further encourages us to cover up parts of ourselves for fear that will be rejected by others. So really the journey to reestablishing positive and nurturing connections is reconnecting with ourselves, reminding ourselves, doing some of the work and taking some of the opportunities to remind ourselves of the value and the worth that we have, calming our nervous system down, calming our mind down, re-expanding that aperture so that we ensure, as we go out to pursue new connections and new sense of belonging or a new tribe, that we're doing so from a perspective that we are worthy of and capable of, kind of the love and acceptance or that sense of belonging that we want to establish.
What is it about people in general that makes us dwell so much on our negative personality traits instead of our positive? We all have a friend where we say, I know he's got that one quirk, but he's a good dude overall. But we'll never give that grace to ourselves. What's up with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this comes back to our nature of survival, our survival instincts. So we can see and we can cast some of these judgments against ourselves that we wouldn't hold against others in the same light. And this comes back to that nature of identifying threats or being mindful of threats. So if we've made mistakes in the past, if we've exhibited or demonstrated some weaknesses that we have in the past, then the challenge is this could be an attribute. This could be something about us that leads to a potential future threat. So in the survival
Hmm.
instinct and us trying to navigate and avoid future threats, it kind of attunes our mind to be most mindful of those things that we dislike about ourselves. Now, if we went and had a major success, if you know, landed a great project, or if you had a major win, if you got an A on that hard test in high school or in college, that's not going to become a future threat to your overall well-being. So just like, you know, I think sometimes as our mind as a large browser tab or a Chrome tab, and we have all these windows open in the background, well, because we want to focus our energy and attention on survival, if something's not a potential threat, then we tend to discount that and allow that to kind of
Hmm.
shift to the back of our mind. However, if there's a mistake I made yesterday, if I spoke up when I shouldn't have, or said something I shouldn't have, or if I acted out in a way that if continued, I might, you know, lose my job or suffer consequences in a relationship, then that's something that would become a future threat if I were to repeat it. So therefore, I must be more mindful of it. Don't forget that thought. Don't allow that
Okay.
awareness to escape our attention, because that could become a future threat. So this is our body's inclination. This is our mind's inclination, our natural hardwiring for preservation. However, there is a beautiful opportunity and a lot of benefit that can be gained by bringing some intention to the things that we allow ourselves to think about or be mindful of. This is why one of the most profound things that I can help somebody do is to expand that perspective on how they view themselves. We're not going to discount. I'm not saying that you don't have certain weaknesses. I'm not saying that you didn't make a mistake. But what I am saying is that along with those mistakes and those weaknesses, there's this large list of strengths that you have, and there's a longer list of wins and successes that you've had in your life. So let's expand that aperture to be able to recognize this and have this in our mental awareness as we go out into the world or as we lean into our life.
Right. Hmm. So a lot of this sounds there's going to be guys who are and gals who have really devolved into true substance abuse, true addiction, actual, you know, tearing apart of their life, things like that. But there's also a huge amount of folks who are really just dealing with all of this in their head,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I I wonder. First of all, is the military offering and giving mental health assistance like while in service? You know, are we addressing some of the could be all in my head stuff before sending people out into the world on their own?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it has continued to evolve, but there are a lot more programs that are invested in helping individuals with the challenges that come up in their life. There are, you know, on active duty, there's a lot more programs now about mental health awareness, overall, you know, just general wellness. And anything that's offered in the military also comes with some limitations. So back to this meeting of our fundamental needs that allows or that promotes our wellness and our overall mental and emotional well-being. There's a big component of that strong sense of meaning, which I alluded to, is also what provides our capacity to endure suffering. So what I see
Right.
is a lot of individuals that are going through their military career, and while they're serving, they're facing some normal life challenges. You know, we have you know, health challenges, relationship challenges, family challenges, financial challenges. There's normal battles and struggles that individuals might face as they're in their military career. Yet while they're doing so, they have a strong foundation of this connection, this sense of belonging, this tribe that they can rely on. They have a profound sense of meaning that provides that capacity to endure some of life's challenges. Yet when they leave the military and they lose that foundation, now some of those same things that they were able to effectively deal with before, they no longer have the capacity. So that thing that wasn't as overwhelming before might now be a showstopper or a hill too steep to climb, which
Oh.
is a pathway for a lot of individuals to now become over reliant on substances and behaviors that maybe they also used while they were in the military, but it wasn't a lifeline for them at a time. It wasn't a needed coping mechanism at the time, but it has evolved into that as their capacity to deal with life challenges has eroded.
Hmm. Yeah, it's kind of another area where, you know, being in the military service and having all of your needs actually met by the military very intentionally
Mhm.
is, a huge win if you definitely need that. But the transition out is always going to be a little bit of an issue.
Right.
I don't know. All right. How do we, I guess, we can go through and work on connection and authenticity, meaning, and building all of that. And you can do that through family. You can do that through employment, the different things like that. There's a lot of different ways to find connection at a minimum, right? Because you just need a friend
Right.
down the street. Post service, what kind of support is being offered to service members, to veterans now at this point, to work on specifically the connection and meaning components? Because I know that mental health therapy, obviously medical, is available through the VA hospitals, but when we're talking about trying to like really foster the connection and meaning, the stuff that, kind of beats the mental health and the suicide risk and things like that, what's being offered, I guess, at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of services through the VA. There's a lot of organizations and nonprofits, a lot of veteran service organizations that are all trying to provide resources for that connection, some mentorship, some
Hmm.
coaching to help find that sense of meaning or regain that sense of meaning. And there's some obvious barriers that I see to connecting service members with some of these resources. First and foremost, though technically when you grab that DD 214 or the discharge paperwork, you go from a service member to now you're a veteran. However, the feeling or the self-identity doesn't change as quickly. As a service member, I had this
Mm.
vision of what veterans were, and I just thought it was a bunch of old guys and gals sitting around VFWs and American
Right.
Legions talking about a service that I wasn't part of and an era of the military that I have no experience in. So in my mind, I was like, I don't know those. I'm not one of those yet. Like, that's not my tribe. I can't connect with those individuals,
Sure.
nor did I, want to go spend my time in bars and ruminating over the past. But what I didn't realize, and that was just the image that I had of what the veteran community was like. So I knew I was no longer a part of active duty service, but yeah, I didn't yet feel like I was part of the veteran community. So fortunately, there's a lot of new veteran organizations, individuals that more recently transitioned out of the military that are engaged in some things. Whether somebody in a service member recently transitioned service member feels called to be a part of that, it's kind of challenging. For me, I'd spent almost 17 years in the military. I knew who, Captain Biss was at that moment, but I didn't know who Garrett was. So my thought was like, I want to grow out my hair and go figure out who I am beyond this uniform. So that was another thing that kind of drove me away from really wanting to, I guess I'd witnessed and I'd seen a lot of people that seemed like they were stuck in their progress or stuck in their mind that they were still, they, uh, felt like they were kind of stuck in their transition from that military mindset and culture, and they always wanted to be looked at and thought of and seen as that former service member. I wanted to experience something different. There's another challenge based on the culture and really kind of the mindset of military service in that when those struggles do start to mount and somebody does begin to suffer, I don't know if it's pride, it's ego, or it's just the kind of mentality that's conditioned in us where there's this natural aversity to or aversion to seeking help for some internal challenges that you're facing. A lot of us we don't, we're trained to not be a draw on the resources in the community. We don't want to be seen as the broken person or the problem child that needs
Right.
extra love and attention. And if that carries into the civilian world, then that can lead an individual to a situation where the problems mount up a little bit too quickly or they get to too dark of a place. There's this other kind of interesting aspect of military service and where we derive our sense of value as a service member in our association between one's capacity to endure difficulty and suffering and the value that they have to the uniform or to the military. Some of those service members that we revere the most, if we're thinking, special operators, SEALs, Rangers, Marine Recon, one of the things that we that we value about them the most is that they've demonstrated their capacity to go into the most austere environments and survive some of the most challenging situations that a human can survive. And I think what this creates is this sense of, there's a lot of there's a lot of confidence and self worth that comes from all service members and our willingness to go forward and operate in austere environments, or willingly go into harm's way and live in not not the most suitable living conditions and still function very well. But I think this creates this unfair or this unrealistic representation in our mind that somehow my value and my worth as a service member or as an individual comes from my capacity to either do more with less or to survive and to perform well in difficult and challenging situations, to show up on little sleep, to live for days with little food and little water. And if we carry that same perspective to the civilian world, I think a lot of veterans, they'll experience the suffering and maybe witnessed their loss or their losing capacity to endure some of those challenges. But if they're relating their self-worth and their value as an individual to how well they can endure the struggle and the suffering, this can also delay somebody's experience or somebody's willingness to get and to seek help.
Well, that's just another one of them double downs on the negatives, right? You're training people to, as David Goggins might say, embrace the suck.
Hmm.
Then you're throwing them into the suck. Who's going to try to climb out of it when the MO, the standard operating procedure is to just deal with it on your own for the greater good of the team, etc.
Hmm.
So hard to then, I guess, even just you could tell a veteran like, hey, there's support, but like if they're thinking in their head, no, I'll just deal with this for a little while. How do we make that transition? How do you convince them to even start going to the support or start seeking out connection or any of these other things?
I think one great thing that we can do is to come on shows like I'd Like to Know More and to normalize stories about what that journey and what that struggle might look like, instead of highlighting the suffering that individuals can endure or the ability to grind more or to lean more into the struggle. Let's talk more about some of the real consequences that come as a result of it. Let's
Hmm.
talk more about the loss of capacity and really the loss of value that we can provide when we neglect or we ignore for too long what's going on inside of us. And one of the childhood stories I think back to often now is the giving tree. I know you're familiar
Uh,
with the giving tree and the story of the little boy who goes to a tree and he takes and takes and takes from the tree throughout his life.
uh-huh.
I used to think that was an inspirational story reminding us that, like, we always have a little more that we can give that's of value, but now I look at it as a really sadistic message that is demonstrating what happens when we give more of ourself than what we can endure for a long period of time. This tree that is now a stump in the ground for an old man to sit on no longer has the capacity to provide the apples or provide the shade that it once did because it overgave of what it had. And I think when we can get people in touch with the costs that we bear from the overgiving of ourselves, or that willingness to grind, that willingness to endure the suffering in the moment, and the real cost that it has to the value that we can provide or the service that we can give in the future, then this might awaken some individuals to realizing that maybe it's not, it's not worth continuing to bear this unnecessary burden without seeking some kind of help to deal with it more effectively. Because as we grow as individuals, then our capacity to give or to serve or to endure more can also grow. But if we're not intentional about it, then that's not going to happen. You can sit here and want to be in better shape all day long, but if you don't bring some intention behind it and do some actions for it, then you're
Absolutely.
you're desiring to, you can't just rest your laurels on the fact that you used to be in incredible physical shape, years ago. You've got to recognize that as things change and times change and situation changes, then there's different things that we need to do and be aware of in order to be the best version of ourselves, not just today, but for the future.
Hmm. And what can the civilian counterparts the folks who the service members are hoping to connect with to help.
Yeah, so a lot of this comes back again to that connection and authenticity. So what individuals can do, the service members can do, is first, like I said, reconnect with yourself, become more mindful of the strengths and the wins that you've had in your life. Train yourself and adjust your mindset to see yourself in a more positive light. Because when you do this, then when you lean into new connections or when you show up in new environments, you retain that self-confidence to show up authentically and not to put
Mm,
yourself in a position where another person's rejection is going to affect the way that you feel about yourself. You know, if we're connected with the value and the worth that we have enough as an individual, and if somebody else doesn't like us, then that's not detrimental to our overall well-being because it's not signaling a potential rejection or loss of connection.
right.
For individuals that want to connect with or encourage others to show up authentically, then we can do a lot of work on the way that we see and that we approach other individuals, be more inviting of them to share their truth, to share what they really think and prevent ourselves from allowing them to feel rejected. You know, this is a big challenge that veterans face is there's a lot of things that we experience that we learn pretty quickly. There's parts of our truth, parts of our experience, parts of our past that if we were to share that honestly and openly with people that didn't live through a similar experience, very quickly they're going to see us in an unfavorable light. And it's just a quick story. When I was transitioning out of the military, I remember I went to this party and I was trying to socialize with my new civilian counterparts, and we got to talking. They found out that I was in the Marines, and they seemed curious about it, and they started asking me questions. So I was telling them a little bit about what the experience was. And then I said, well, here's an interesting fact about what I'm experiencing right now in this moment as we're standing here in this apartment and having these conversations. I said, even as we're having this dialogue, my mind is kind of in a hypervigilant state. So I'm assessing potential threats that are around me. I'm very aware of my surroundings, where there could be exits if need be. Oh, and here's a fun fact. I'm also scanning the room and I see what we call in the military as weapons of opportunity. So I notice that there's something on that bookshelf over there and there's something on that table that should a threat arise, there's something that I can reach for to help me neutralize whatever this threat is. And as I was sharing this, thinking like, oh, this is something they might find fascinating, what I witnessed was the expressions on their face and their enthusiasm in getting to know me a little bit better seemed to wane significantly. And what I took away from this experience was, oh, there's parts of who I am and parts of my experience that I better hide from others if I want them to see me in a way that's worthy of their connection. And this is one of the experiences of many that I had where it showed me, hey, you better start to wear masks as you navigate this new environment, because if you don't, then it's going to potentially cost you that connection. What I wasn't aware of at the time was the cost that we bear when we have to go into environments and wear these masks. So I share that along with the message in my TEDx talk to just help non-military, non-veteran individuals to first understand that internal struggle that a lot of veterans are facing, regardless of what they experienced in the military, regardless of whether they had some battlefield trauma or some military sexual trauma while they were in the service. That transition from military service itself is a very real potential traumatic experience for individuals as they lose that sense of positive identity, that connection, and that sense of meaning, which is
Yeah.
not unlike, as you alluded to in the beginning, which is not unlike experiences of major transitions that anybody might go through. This is why I try to bring a lot of my focus and my work back to how is the human experience mapped to that veteran transition in a way that people that haven't gone through that transition can understand it. We as humans all have these fundamental needs for connection, authenticity, and meaning. And anybody going through a major transition can suffer some of the consequences of losing the way that they've come to meet those needs, whether you're transitioning from one career or moving across the country. Your children have grown and left home and now you're an empty nester. Like your identity, your mission, your sense of connection, the ways that you show up authentically, all of that changes. And there's some very real consequences of that change and some awarenesses that we need to have if we want to do our best through and beyond that transition.
Yeah, I think identity is potentially the biggest any identity crisis is the biggest threat that humans ever really face because
Hmm.
I mean, I think I heard somebody say that stage fright actually comes from when we used to have to defend ourselves against being kicked out of the tribe for some atrocity or whatever.
Hmm.
But there's also you have many examples throughout history of when specific identities were treated in certain ways. Even if it's just short people don't get to play basketball, or you can go all the way down the road to slavery or anything else.
Right.
Identity has always been a crazy, 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 crazy thing, especially with the human instinct to have in group, out group. And I think when you were telling the story about you wearing the mask after describing your hypervigilance, I actually had a thought while you were saying that of like maybe sometimes the mask is fine. Like maybe
Sure.
don't. It's hard for me to say because I'm not in your shoes and it
Hmm.
doesn't feel good to me, and I'm looking at it back on the back end. But like, um, I can understand how someone, when being told that by a veteran, might be now worried that the person that you're talking to doesn't want to be part of the group, is
Hmm.
looking for ways to get out of the group, looks
Sure.
negatively upon the group, because it almost sounds like you're assuming they're a threat. So the mask of "I'm on your team, whatever you say goes"
Right.
could be beneficial to the extent that that mask doesn't get you wrapped up in some sort of criminal activity. Because we've seen movies
Right.
where people get Um, but it also
No,
reminded me of a time.
yeah, I appreciate bringing up that nuance. It's a very important point because I always talk about the value and the need for authenticity. But with that, I also recognize that, for one, our authentic self is going to be different in different environments. The person that I
Okay,
am when I'm on my knees playing with my 3-year-old son is not the version of me that shows up here on this podcast or goes out into the community. But it doesn't mean that I'm not being an authentic representation of myself, or
right.
that I don't have some connections in my life where I can be fully authentic. But I think what I wish people would be mindful of is, if you don't have any connections or any relationships in your life where you can be authentic, or if you're constantly showing up in environments like your workplace or in your community where you feel that you can't be a representation of who you are, we need to be mindful of the costs of that. If you're doing
Mm,
so, if you're trying to show up continuously in a way that will be seen in a positive light, yet it's coming at a cost of the way that you feel about yourself, then that's a very important thing to be mindful of. Also, this tendency, and this comes back to really the first steps of reconnecting with ourselves, regaining some internal regulation and connection to our positive traits, because the more that we diverge from that, then it leads us to a survival state where we need connection from others. Therefore, we need to continuously navigate our perceived expectations of others. And we can see how this can
mm,
be a very dynamic and stressful situation. In the extreme,
right.
maybe it's a codependent relationship, or there's, lesser variations of that where individuals are really kind of always on edge because they're reading the room, they're looking at other people's expressions and navigating, how do I stay in a favorable light here? And if your sense of value and self-worth is wrapped up only in how other people perceive you, then the cost of that potential rejection is much greater to your mental and emotional well-being, than it could be. So that's why I think it's important to be mindful of that authenticity and that representation. And like you talked about, they say the top two fears in life are, fear of falling and fear of public speaking. And through this cam lens, this connection authenticity lens, that it makes sense to me, because the consequence of fumbling your words or saying something wrong when you're in front of an audience of 12 or 50 or 100 people is exponentially greater than if you're having a one-on-one conversation with somebody and you misspoke or you said something wrong. That mass potential for rejection all in one foul swoop is a
Yeah.
much greater perceived threat to our well-being. So this can lead people into that survival state, and then start churning those negative thoughts of, oh, what if I mess up? What if I say something wrong? What if they think something, something poor about me? That, I think, exacerbates and leads people to that fear of public speaking and the overwhelming anxiety that can come when somebody steps behind a microphone.
How do you determine if you're in a position or a circumstance where you're not allowed to be authentic? I can imagine a situation where someone's not aware that they're wearing a mask.
Yeah, so if you feel that, if you have thoughts, if you have wants, if you have needs that you're afraid to express, then that would be a key indicator that you're forced into a situation where you can't be authentic. And again, it doesn't have to mean that you can do that in every situation. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you walk into a crowded restaurant and start demanding your needs to be met or sharing your innermost personal thoughts. But if you don't have any place that you can express those things, then that's an indicator that some of the social anxiety or some of the fear or some of the isolation tendencies might be driven by that lack of that proper social connection, at least in some context in your life.
I like that. That's a pretty succinct and easily played with little triage. That makes a lot of sense. Cool. Any final thoughts? Anything that we can leave on an inspirational upbeat note?
Yeah, I'll just share with anybody that's listening, veteran, non-veteran, but anybody that's out there. If you're going through a difficult or a challenging time in your life, if you're really in that darkness and really struggling, and I want you to know first that you are lovable and acceptable just as you are. Regardless of whatever you've experienced in the past or your present position in life, there's something in you, within you, that is of value, and you are deserving of getting to a better experience. And if you don't know that for yourself, then I'm telling you that now, and I'm sure you'll echo this sentiment that there's something about you, that you're lovable, acceptable, and valuable as a human just as you are. And I want for you to find the tools, the resources, make the connections so that you can remember that and you can begin experiencing the version of your life that you want and that you deserve.
Oh, that's beautiful, Garrett. Okay, so where can people find you?
So an easy way to find me on LinkedIn is probably where I'm most active. So you can just search my name, Garret Biss, on LinkedIn. You can also go to my website, garretbiss.com, and I can share this with you for the show notes. And if anybody's interested and they want to experience a little bit of the work that I do or be introduced to a couple of daily practices or interventions that you can do to create an emotional, a mental health, and in some ways a spiritual reset, you can go check out thewarriorreset.com. And I give you a free 10-day challenge where you can adopt 4 of the daily practices that I've found to be most effective, that you can do all of them in less than 15 minutes a day. So we're coming up on a new year. If you want to turn over a new leaf and step back to or reset to a more grounded, better version of yourself, then that could be a great way to do it. You can just go to thewarriorreset.com and find all the information there.
Awesome. I'll give all the links down in the descriptions, and hopefully everyone floods your email, your inbox, everything else. Garret Biss, it was awesome talking to you. You're a good dude. It sounds like you've got a really solid approach to just being a happy, happy person.
I appreciate that. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate the work that you're doing and bringing some insightful conversations and bringing up some great topics. So thank you so much for that service that you're providing to all the listeners out there.
I appreciate that. Thank you.